What's going on, everybody? Big news this week. Really big news. SGC came out on Wednesday, just a couple of days ago, and announced that they are now going to be charging $15 per card for grading. Now, they were already fairly low at $20, going down $5 more to $15 a card is a really big deal. One of the reasons it's a big deal is because the other companies will be affected. They're going to be affected, and hopefully it forces the other companies to come down as well. So whether you're an SGC person or you're a PSA person, this is a welcome bit of information. One of the big complaints recently about collectors and investors is that the cost to get cards graded is so high that sort of those mid-tier to low-tier cards may not even be worth getting authenticated and graded. But this news changes that. Now, I know there's this big back and forth between PSA and SGC. And to be honest with you, some of the most divisive videos I put out are when I compare SGC and PSA. See, people tend to either be PSA people or they tend to be SGC people. There are only a few of us in the middle that collect both. I collect both. But there are a lot of people that are just SGC or just PSA. So cost is a big factor in this whole thing. Another thing that's a big factor is turnaround time. And SGC has said, even with this reduced price, their turnaround time will stay at 5 to 10 days. So it's still going to be a quick turnaround time. Now, another thing that a lot of people that were on the PSA camp have complained about is that SGC doesn't have an app. Doesn't have an app like PSA does, and PSA has a pretty good app. Well, in the same news on Wednesday, SGC released their app, and it's available right now. So now SGC has an app. SGC just dropped their price to now they're like $10 below PSA. No club fees, no nothing. I'll continue to say that anytime there's competition, it's good for all collectors and it's bad for all of the companies. It's like if you're in the middle of nowhere and there's one gas station, they can charge whatever they want. But if there are gas stations across the street from each other, the prices are going to be better, or else everybody's going to go across the street to the cheaper place. So the only other big issue is, what about the value of cards in different holders? If I've got a PSA 6 of a card, is it worth the same as an SGC 6? Is the SGC 6 worth more than the PSA, or is it worth less than the PSA? Now, it seems to me like more and more people have been open to either company than in the past. Like I said a minute ago, it was always either you're in one camp or the other, and I feel like I'm starting to see some of the people that were just PSA people starting to cross over and collect some of each. So how is this going to affect it? So what I wanted to do with this big news coming out is I went through a ton of data again, and I looked to see how do the values compare. I did not just look at vintage cards, because I know a lot of you collect modern, or you collect junk wax era, or you collect 70s. So what I did is I compared a couple of cards from the 50s, a couple from the 60s, a couple from the 70s, a couple from the 80s, and then a couple of modern cards to compare recent sales over the last 2 or 3 months. The 5 most recent sales at each grade to see how the values compare. Is PSA still more valuable than the same grade in SGC? Or is SGC caught up? Or is SGC worth more? Whenever I do this sort of data dive, it takes me literally hours. And I'm so invested that regardless of what the data shows, I'm gonna run the data and I'm gonna show you what I found. You're gonna be interested to see what this data says. This was big news this week. Values matter. What are the values? Let's take a look at the data collection and the results that I found right here.
All right, so you can see all the tabs at the bottom. I'm currently on the 55 Jackie Robinson. So lots of data that I went out and looked at recent sales from. And if you look here, you can see down the averages, and then you can see the difference between the PSA versus SGC price, and then the number of cards that were included in the average, up to 5. Again, it's the most recent 5 cards that sold. Now, I did this for 2 cards per decade, and I tried to choose cards that made sense. Here's an Ozzie Smith. Now you can see for the Ozzie Smith, there aren't a lot of the low grades. That's not surprising to most of us. When you look at the Ricky Henderson, not too many 1s or 2s, but a lot of the other grades. So again, there's the red and the blue there. I'll talk more about that in a minute. But it has to do with what has the higher value. And when you look here at the Jackie Robinson, for example, or the Bob Gibson, for example, you see that red and you see that blue. Again, I'll talk more about that in a moment, but this is a head-by-head comparison of each of the cards and which one is selling for higher. So the blue means SGC was higher in that grade, and the red was PSA. So you see here, when we look at the Bob Gibson data, it's all red, meaning PSA is higher.
All right. Needless to say, that took some time. And again, we're talking about the most 5 recent sales at each grade over the last 3 months from eBay sales. Now, that means that some cards at some grades, there were more than 5 to pull from, so it was just the last 5. Some cards at some grades, it was, only a couple of cards to create the average. Now, one of the reasons that I chose the cards that I chose is they had to be fairly popular cards and they had to be somewhat valuable cards, because otherwise they wouldn't be graded at all of the different grades. So yeah, for example, if it was an inexpensive card, nobody's going to grade it if it's a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, for example. So they are not all rookie cards. I tried to pick some rookie cards, some non-rookie cards. I tried to pick some popular cards because then there would be actual purchases that were made. So there are some limitations. And I know right off the bat, people will tell me how this data is useless and this data is flawed. Listen, whenever you're doing a sample survey, it's not going to be 100% accurate. There's always going to be margins of error. And when you say, oh, well, you only picked 2 cards per decade, you only looked at 10 cards total. Keep in mind, when we're looking at like NBC polls for presidential elections, they only surveyed 1,000 people for the entire country. And they have, polling that is at like 97, 98% accuracy. So for data to be accurate, you don't need thousands and thousands and thousands of samples. The more, the better for sure. And I'm not trying to act like this data is perfect, but it does tell us something. It does tell us something about what cards are selling at different price points. The margin of error is not going to be 1 or 2%. It's going to be higher than that. But it's a snapshot to give us an idea of the value comparison of different cards from different decades in the two most popular grading companies. So let's take a look at the averages now that you know where the data came from, how it was tabulated. Let's look at the actual results, one card at a time, and we're going to zip through it quickly, but we'll be able to compare at each grade, each card, what are they selling at recently. I'm going to continue to update this data. I'm going to continue to revisit this because I think it's important, because valuation of cards at different grades in different companies is something we should be paying attention to. So let's look at the data. Let's look at the averages. Let's see what we think.
All right, so a little bit of a closer analysis now. So again, this is the 1955 Jackie Robinson. Bunch of different cards from a bunch of different decades. This is just the first one. And if we look at the data here, we're comparing the average sale price of a PSA 1 versus an SGC 1 of this card. And then a PSA 2 versus an SGC 2 of this card. So that is the data in that column on the left. If you look on the right, you'll see SGC is blue, and it came out 7% higher for an SGC 3 than a PSA 3. But in every other grade where we had a head-by-head comparison, PSA came out as being worth more. Same with Bob Gibson. So when we look at the Bob Gibson here, in the PSA 2, the PSA Gibsons on average sold for 18% more than the average SGC. And in the 3, it's 30% more than the average SGC 3, and so on. And you can see that across the board, PSA kind of reigns for the Bob Gibson. Now, why is that? There could be a lot of reasons, but the fact that it was a clean sweep for Gibson is interesting. And as we get to the higher grade, like the 6, it's 20% higher in a PSA than an SGC. But then, on the contrary, we have a 64 Pete Rose, which is one of the cards from the 60s that I chose. Of the 6 where we had data for both PSA and SGC, SGC came out ahead. So why might that be? I have no idea. But it is interesting. So, for example, the PSA 1 versus the SGC 1, the SGC was selling for way more. But you know, we can see all of them, but then right there in the middle, we have PSA is a little ahead for a couple of the grades too. Now, when we look at the 65 Steve Carlton rookie, this one's a little bit mixed. So we have some PSA ahead in 4 of the grades, and SGC's ahead in 2 of the grades. One of the grades, in the 4, the SGC's way ahead. It sold for a lot more. But then when we look at the 8 grade, the PSA sold for quite a bit more than the SGC. So now we look at the Nolan Ryan from that famous 71 set, and 4 of the 6 are SGC and 2 are PSA. It's interesting that, again, the highest grade is PSA is ahead. That seems to be a bit of a trend, that in the higher grades, PSA's a little bit ahead. But right there in the middle, 4 straight grades, SGC is higher. So why would that be different for this card than, for example, the Bob Gibson or the Jackie Robinson that just had 1? And then that highest grade, the 7, look at how much more the PSA sells for than the SGC. That's also interesting. Another card from the 70s is the Ozzie Smith rookie card. So the 2 and the 3 were quite a bit higher for PSA The 7 and the 8 were quite a bit higher for the PSA. But then the ones in the middle, the 4, 5, and 6, SGC is easily ahead there. So again, interesting. Now we're going to look at a summary here in a minute. We're not just going to look at the raw data. We're going to look at a summary where you can see it all together, and I think you're going to find a trend. The Ricky Henderson in a 3, SGC was quite a bit ahead, but then every other grade, the PSA was ahead. And again, look at the 9. Look at how much further ahead a PSA 9 is than an SGC 9. So another trend we keep seeing is that the PSA in the high grades are not just higher than SGC, but a lot higher. That trend continues here in the higher grades of the Tony Gwynn. Not a lot of 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s of Tony Gwynn, but in the 5, the SGC is a little bit higher, not a lot. So if you're getting a 7, 8, or a 9, the PSA is higher for the Tony Gwynn. So again, this a card from the 80s. Had 2 cards, the Henderson and the Gwynn from the 80s, and then a couple more modern cards. So we got the famous Mike Trout rookie card. And you look, obviously there aren't going to be many 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, or 5s in a card this new. But again, across the board, PSA wins. And in the highest grade, the 10, it is the most ahead, which again seems to be a trend. Now, why is that? Could be a lot of things. Might be the fact that the PSA registry, people with deep pockets that are heavy into the PSA registry, are the ones buying up the expensive grades and the expensive cards, maybe. So here we go again. No SGCs in anything except for a 9 or a 10. But PSA, again, is a fair amount ahead in the 9 and the 10 grade in this Shohei Ohtani card. And now here we can see the whole chart. So over on the right, you can see the average of the averages. And look at how as the grades get higher, PSA takes a stronger commanding lead. But there's other information. I kind of look at this as like a heat map, like when you look at a batter that's up to bat in a baseball game, where are they hot and where are they cold? You know how they kind of show the regions. To me, that's kind of what this looks like. And if we kind of start to examine it, it does kind of have 3 different regions in it, which I find interesting. So again, on the right, it shows the average of the averages, and the higher the grade, PSA takes more of a commanding lead. Now, the newer cards are on the right, the older cards on the left, the higher grades on the bottom, the lower grades on the top. So the newer and higher grade cards, PSA is dominating. The older cards, PSA is dominating. So again, on the left are the older cards. On the bottom are the higher grade cards. On the right are the newer cards. So it seems like PSA is the strongest in the newer cards and the higher grade cards. And SGC is gathering the stuff in the middle, just the regular old collector. When we look at the total cards graded in this sample, again, this is kind of the issue, or one of the bigger issues for SGC versus PSA, is there are so many more PSA graded cards than SGC, which we kind of know because whenever we look at the data at the end of each month and how many cards PSA and SGC graded.
So what are your takeaways from this? Is there anything that this data tells you that really kind of tells a story? For me personally, it seems to me like the higher grade of the card, people are drawn to PSA. Is that because more investors are drawn to PSA holders? Is that because the higher grade cards are the cards that people want to show off in their set registry. And so PSA set registry is really getting the higher end, higher grade cards, not only sent to PSA, but purchased at a higher value. Or does it not tell us a lot? When we looked at that heat map data, to me, was the most interesting. It seemed like the mid-grade cards in the 60s and 70s especially, SGC was more popular. But for the super expensive cards, and when I think of the expensive cards from that grouping, it's the Jackie, right? The Jackie's one of the more expensive cards. Another one of the more expensive cards from that grouping is the high-end Ricky Henderson, the high-end 71 Nolan Ryan, the Bob Gibson. So when it comes to the expensive stuff, seems like PSA has a stronghold. But when it comes to the middle cost, middle grade, a collector just wants to pick it up and have a decent copy of it. It seems to me like that's kind of the sweet spot right now from SGC. That's my takeaway. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you saw something that stood out. I hope this was helpful, and I'm going to continue to monitor SGC versus PSA. It's a major theme of my channel, is comparing those two, staying up to date on what they're doing and how we're all affected. Because I think it's important, because where we are right now with grading and with card collecting, what's happening in the grading industry really affects all of us as collectors, even if we prefer our cards ungraded. Let me know what you think.